Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture, The Art of Researcher Services. So here, of course, we have a famous detail from the Sistine Chapel where God reaches down to Adam and passes the divine spark to him. And I kind of like to think that this is the role that reference archivists play within an archival setting. So reaching down and providing the spark of knowledge to researchers who are interested in using the records within an archive for whatever purpose suits their information need. So maybe a little bit of a grandiose metaphor or connection, but I think on some level a fitting one as well. Okay, so here are our weekly topics for this week. What is a reference interview? How do researchers approach discovering archival materials? And what role do archivists have in supporting patron research? And we'll be looking at 3 of our learning objectives for this course. So we'll start by looking at some definitions. This is from the Essays Glossary of Archival and Records Terminology. So reference, service to aid patrons in locating materials relevant to their interests. And from the Kearns book, we define archival interaction as any social or technological interaction by an archivist or archival system that aids patrons in locating the materials or evidence or information relevant to their interests that is meaningful and actionable to the patron. So the Kearns chapter is focused on not just reference work, but researcher services as a whole. So reference work is certainly part of researcher services, but as we'll talk about later, there are sort of other pieces to the puzzle as well. And oftentimes reference staff within an archives are involved or should be involved in additional aspects of helping researchers find the information that they're looking for. So again, information relevant to their interests that is meaningful and actionable to the patron. So a researcher comes in with an information need and they work with a reference archivist, assuming that a reference archivist is involved with their search for information, and they find information that is relevant to their interests. In addition, is actually meaningful. So something can be relevant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it meaningfully meets your information need. And then something that is actionable. So something that you can actually use to meet your information needs. So maybe you're working on a family history, maybe you're trying to write a scholarly article. So ideally, the information that you find is something that you can translate into some sort of action to meet your information need. Okay, so next we'll look at some connections between researcher services and some of the things that we have talked about in this course and things that we will talk about later on in the semester as well. So appraisal is an interesting connection. So ideally during appraisal, the archive is collecting information about the creator of a particular set of records and sort of taking notes about their important activities, the records that document those important activities, just biographical and organizational history details. And those notes can be a really valuable reference tool. So if those notes are available to reference archivists or researcher services archivists, they can look at those notes and say, well, here's the answer to your question, instead of having to go through the actual records themselves and spending that extra time and effort to find information, which ideally is already available through information that was gathered during appraisal. So it just goes back to the importance of appraisal and how thorough, detailed appraisal can support a lot of different functions that archives engage in. Okay, next we'll look at arrangement and description. This can also be a big influence on researcher services. So if records are arranged and described really thoroughly, then that can make it easier for either researchers to find the information on their own, or with maybe a minimal amount of archival intervention, or if the intervention by a reference archivist is needed, then good arrangement and description can make it easier for the reference archivist to help the researcher find information. So if you have a collection that's described really well, maybe to the folder level or to the item level, you can look at a find aid pretty quickly and say, okay, well, this looks like information that might be relevant to what you're looking for, and then present the researcher with options and let them go from there. If records are described very broadly, say at like a series level, then it's just going to take a lot more effort to figure out where relevant information might be. Online access is also an interesting connection. So generally speaking, the better or more developed digital collections are, the less need there is going to be for a reference archivist to intervene, because researchers will have contextual links which will connect them to information and will help them discover information that may be valuable for their information need. And they may be able to do this with very little intervention by an archivist. Or again, if a researcher does need help from an archivist, then having online collections, and we'll again throw in online find aids here, that are well developed and have useful features and really well developed contextual clues and tools, then that's just going to make the job of the reference archivist easier as well. So investing in good digital collections can, again, save time and money in the long run. And one of our readings for this week commented on how, because of the fact that a lot of researchers do access materials, archival materials online, and may not have much interaction with researchers at all, or with archivists at all, then reference archivists should have a role in developing online collections and making sure that online collections contain important information that researchers will need to conduct research on their own. Preservation is an interesting one. Obviously, the preservation state of materials is going to impact how available materials are for researchers. So if physical items are really fragile, then they may be unavailable for researchers to look at in the reading room. That can impact the availability of the information contained on them. If records are being preserved in a way that can really alter their appearance, then that may reduce the research value of those records and make them less useful for researchers who come into the archive to use them. Or it may skew their thoughts about a record in a particular way that might not be truthful. So there are a few connections there. And outreach. In a lot of ways, researcher services can be the best form of outreach that an archive has. So if you are able to set up an information ecosystem through online access, through reference archivists who are able to connect researchers with information in an efficient and comprehensive way, then that's going to reflect well in the archive, and it's going to make people want to use archives again. It's going to make people want to value archives and support archives, and that can have a lot of benefits for archives down the road. Anytime a person comes to an archive in need of information, which might have really profound personal implications, like if you're trying to figure out where your family came from, or if you're trying to find information that can help you, write a thesis or help you write a scholarly article, which is really going to improve your career or help your academic career. And archives are able to help researchers find that information and meet that need. That's a really valuable service, and it's one that really does resonate with people, and it can make them supportive of archives. So in a lot of ways, researcher services are the public-facing elements of archives. Things like appraisal and arrangement, description, and preservation can take place in the background. But when the public is interacting with online access, interacting with reference archivists, getting instructional workshops from archivists, that's very public facing. And if it goes well, it can really improve the image that people have of archives and make them more supportive of archives. And of course, if it goes poorly, then that can really negatively impact a person's estimation of archives. So it can go both ways, but ideally, researcher services can be a really valuable way for archives to demonstrate why they matter and why they should be supported. So some things that reference services or researcher services provide. This is from the first edition of the Currents book. Information about the repository, about the holdings, from the holdings, information about records creators, referrals to other repositories, information about laws and ethics, instruction on the use of records, education about the research process, and physical access to materials. So that's quite a big list that can require archives to have a lot of different skills and a lot of different backgrounds. And again, this information can come through an interaction with a reference archivist. It can come through an interaction with the archive's online collections and online finding aids, or it can come via instructional sessions or instructional workshops that the archives provide. So all three of those things can be the vectors through which this information is transferred to researchers. And again, the more efficiently and the more straightforwardly this transfer occurs, the better it is for researchers and the better it is for archivists, which really, again, speaks to the importance of appraisal and arrangement description, having good online collections, and having an infrastructure in place which supports the transfer of all these different types of knowledge to researchers in an efficient and useful way. So a lot of the different types of knowledge that reference and researcher services archivists should have or need to have are mentioned in the Duff, Yackel, and Thibault article, where they break down different types of archival reference knowledge into 3 different categories. So we have interaction knowledge, research knowledge, and collection knowledge. And then we have things in the interaction knowledge of people, so just knowing how to work with people, how to communicate with people. Access systems, so how do you look at online collections? How do you use the catalog? How do you request materials from the archive that you want to look at when you come to the repository? And then institutional knowledge, so just when is the archive open? What are the archive's policies? It could be something like, where do I park? Things of that nature that are related to a specific institution that the archive is a part of. Then we have research knowledge. So research, which is helping people who use archives just conduct research, maybe suggesting different strategies that they can pursue to find the information that they're looking for. Artifactual research knowledge, which is understanding aspects of the physical nature of the records themselves. So for instance, being able to look at a record and seeing the paper that a letter was written on and being able to use that to understand, maybe like the time period that the record came from. And then we have domain knowledge, which is just a general knowledge of a particular historical topic. So domain knowledge related to, World War I, domain knowledge related to the cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee. Just having sort of a general knowledge of a different or of a particular aspect or subject in history and being able to convey that information to researchers. And then we have collection knowledge. So knowledge of holdings, knowing just what's in your archive, knowing sort of the options within your archives for researchers who come to use your materials, and then contextual knowledge of holdings. So having an understanding of how the collections in your archive relate to each other, having knowledge of how different records within a collection relate to each other, even knowing how your collection materials relate to collection materials that might be at other repositories. So just having a broad understanding of records within a repository that might be all related to a particular person or a particular topic or a particular event, and being able to share that knowledge with researchers. And again, all of these different types of knowledge, to certain extents, can be shared with researchers, again, either through interaction with the reference archivist, through interactions with online systems, or through instructional workshops. So on your online collections, you might have information about your institution and its hours and things like that. You might have digital collections that are under the umbrella of a particular, topic or theme in history, and say, this is an overview of World War I, and here are some of the collections related to World War I that we have in our repository. Knowledge of holdings, that's something that is going to be maybe a little difficult to convey through online collections unless an archive is really careful about making sure that researchers understand that there are more records in an archive than just the ones that they can see in an archive's online collections website. But it's certainly one that archives can relate. If you're having an instructional workshop with researchers and that they're interested in a particular topic, that's a good opportunity to say, hey, here are some records related to this and this and this that we have. And then contextual knowledge of collections is one that I think it's really important to convey, especially within the online environment, because again, there may not be sort of the guiding hand of a real live archivist helping people navigate through different collections that might be related to their area of interest. And so archives have to kind of set up the path for researchers to follow on their own. And it's also important to consider that not all of these are going to be employed in every interaction that a researcher has with an archives researcher services. So it may not be that a researcher really cares about the the type of paper used by George Washington when he wrote a letter. And may not be that a researcher really needs to know, when an archive is open because they're just interested in working through things online and from a distance. And so a part of being a reference archivist and a part of contributing to researcher services is sort of knowing what to use when, and in making sure that you're able to have at least some background within these different types of archival reference knowledge, but again, just knowing where and when to employ them, and not trying to use all of them all the time and maybe overwhelming researchers with information that they don't really want or don't really need. And of course, your ability to employ and use these different types of archival reference knowledge is going to depend on your level of experience as an archivist, maybe how long you've worked at a particular archive. It can take a while before you really know how to navigate through an archive's access systems because they may vary from archive to archive. It may take a while before you have a really strong grasp of the holdings within your archives and how they relate to each other. So as the Duff, Yackel, and Tibble article states, it just can be a matter of getting familiar with all these things over time and eventually being able to convey this information to researchers, efficiently and with a fair amount of skill. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the information that researcher services can provide and connect them to some of the ARCs that we just talked about. So information about the repository, that would be institution knowledge. Information about the holdings would be a knowledge of holdings, contextual knowledge of holdings, domain knowledge and artifactual knowledge. Information from the holdings, that would be access, so teaching researchers how to look at things like online finding aids, looking at things like online collections, looking at things like an online catalog, and finding information from the holdings that way. Information about records creators, holdings, contextual, domain, and artifactual again. So just having a sense through these types of knowledge about different records creators, how they might be represented in your holdings, how they might be related to each other, how they might relate to a specific aspect or theme in history, and what types of records they might have created. Referrals to other repositories is mostly related to contextual knowledge of holdings. Information about laws and ethics is going to be something that is going to be tied into access. So making sure when researchers are accessing your materials, either through online collections, that they are aware of any copyright issues or legal considerations that they have, or that the records have. Instruction on the use of records. This is going to be closely tied with our research arc. Education about the research process, the same. Physical access to materials, probably most connected to access. So if a researcher comes into the archive, they know how to request boxes. Maybe you could add institutional knowledge to that as well, since there may be a policy kind of regarding that, but I think access is probably the best connection. And the one that is really related to all of these different aspects or types of information that researcher services provides is people knowledge. So just knowing how to be polite, how to build up a rapport with people so that as you are guiding them through the research process, that they feel comfortable, that they feel like you're listening to them, that they feel like you care about their information need, and that you're trying, within the resources that you have to help them meet it. And that can go a long way towards having people feel like they had a good experience with the archives, even if they weren't necessarily able to find the information that they're looking for. And of course, this people arc is maybe less relevant if researchers are doing all of their work through online collections and online access. But when researchers do contact archives and need to work with archives, it's really helpful for archivists to, again, just treat them with respect and, demonstrate professionalism and demonstrate that that you as an archivist do care about what they need. Sometimes this can be a little difficult. I had some patrons when I did reference work at the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center that were a little pushy, that didn't understand some of the other constraints that I was under, other reference requests that I had to answer as well. But you have to kind of take a step back and put yourself in their shoes and still try and be professional, even if you might be maybe a little annoyed by people from time to time. That's just a part of life, right? So looking at some of the challenges related to researcher services. So poorly described records, we talked about this before. Records that are physically difficult to access. So if you work in an archive and maybe the facilities holding your actual records is across town and it takes you, hours to get those records into the reading room, then that can pose a challenge if researchers come in and they need to look at records right away. A lack of time and more involved interactions between archivists and patrons. So sometimes as a reference archivist, I was carrying, 9 or 10 reference requests at one time, and it was just difficult to provide everyone with the amount of care or interaction that I wanted to or that I wished I could. So I just had to learn how to be efficient with my time and maybe be more of a guide and guide people to information that might be relevant to them rather than feeling like I needed to take them exactly where I thought they needed to be. So just having realistic expectations as far as how involved you can get in different reference requests. Researchers unfamiliar with archives and primary source usage. So people may not really know what archives are or how to use them. And so oftentimes it is reference archivists who are tasked with sort of educating them. And there can be a little bit of a learning curve there. And that can present some challenges for a really efficient transfer of information from the archives to the researcher. Researchers with unrealistic expectations. So as I touched on, oftentimes researchers may not realize that there are other reference requests that an archivist is also working on and that you can't sort of move them to the front of the list and spend all of your time helping them, and that you do need to work on other requests simultaneously. So, they can be a little pushy. You just have to kind of rein them in a little bit politely. So providing the same level of service and access to a variety of users, it may be the case where you have a researcher who is interested in a topic that you are really interested in and, really resonates with you. And so you might be tempted to spend extra time on that researcher and not the same amount of time on a researcher who is interested in something that maybe doesn't resonate with you as much, but you still have to be professional and attempt to treat all of your researchers the same. Again, even though in some instances you might be tempted for a variety of reasons to help certain people more than others. And finally, you need to balance access with the protection of records. So this goes back to the connections to preservation. Every time a record is sort of handled in the reading room, that's a possible a time that it's possible that the records could be damaged. Even if you take something out of a folder and put it back in, there's a risk of damage there. So there's a constant balance between wanting to make sure that the records survive and that the information on the records survive in its original state as much as possible, versus also wanting researchers to access the records and use the records and get information from them. Fortunately, with the increased use of online collections, this last one is maybe less of an issue because researchers are, working with scanned images from their own home, and they're actually manhandling the physical record. So that can definitely reduce wear and tear, but the digitization process also has its own preservation risks as well. So there's definitely some room for damage to occur, maybe if in a more limited basis. So all these things can get in the way of this efficient transfer of information that I talked about earlier on in the lecture, and can just kind of complicate this whole process of the transfer of knowledge. So again, researcher services are focused on a few different aspects of archives. So there could be online interactions, so through email or through social media. That could be ways that archives interact with researchers. Email was a very common one when I was an archivist. So that's certainly a part of a reference archivist's life. Interacting with systems. So again, working with digital collections and online finding aids. And this is related to the provenential and the content indexing types of knowledge that the current chapter for this week touches on, attempting as much as possible to make sure that researchers of varying degrees are able to find and use the information that they need to within your online systems, and that they are able to access that information and get where they're going fairly efficiently. And so again, this is what the Bertram article for this week is focused on, having interactions between reference archivists and online finding aids and online collections, so that reference archivists are able to say, well, I think that this could be done a little bit better, or I think that this information would be helpful to provide to researchers, or maybe we can allow researchers to search for this information in a different way because, our experience has shown that that's an efficient way to retrieve information. So what's interesting to think is oftentimes reference archivists themselves are the ones using these online systems, as often or maybe even more often than researchers, because they're the ones who are helping researchers find information that they can't locate on their own. And so that gives reference archivists a really informed perspective on what within online collections or what within online finding aids is working and isn't working. And so as the Bertram article notes, it really makes a lot of sense for reference archives to be involved in the process of evaluating online systems, providing suggestions for how they could be better, and conveying that insider information or insider expertise to the designers of these systems, so that when researchers are presented with these systems, they're able to, again, efficiently find the information that they're looking for. And also, as I've touched on, instruction is a big part of the archival interactions present in researcher services as well. So it could be through an instruction session to a university class, or maybe a group of local genealogists. It could be working with a reference archivist at the reference desk or in the reading room. But reference archivists are tasked with the duty to instruct researchers on how to use records and how they can find the information that they're looking for. And that is certainly a really common type of interaction that that researchers have with archives patrons. So one of the main instructional interactions that archivists have with researchers is through the reference interview. So this is where a researcher reaches out to the archivist, and they're interested in getting more information in order to meet their information need. And this may occur before a researcher has looked at the online collections and other resources that an archive has, or it could be that a researcher has already looked at these online resources and decided that they need more information. So they reach out to the archivist, hoping to get a little bit more detail and a little more info to, again, solve the information need that they have. So the current chapter talks about the different aims of the reference interview. So to clarify the search request, and maybe that a researcher doesn't know exactly what they're looking for, and so the archivist can help them think that through a little bit more, maybe provide suggestions that a researcher hadn't really considered, and say, hey, I know you're saying that you're looking for this, but maybe instead we should look at this information. And that's also related to adjust the focus of the search. So once a researcher has a better idea of what they're looking for, then the archivist can say, okay, well, it sounds like you're really looking for this. So let's go ahead and look at these materials, look at these collections, look at these fine aids that you hadn't really considered before. And it's always good to communicate to researchers what they can anticipate finding. You just don't want to say, hey, go look at this collection, or hey, look at this fine aid, and just kind of leave it at that. You want to kind of let them know what they might find, what the expected results of their search might be, and that will help them evaluate if what you think they're going to get out of looking at something is really relevant to what they're interested in. So you might say, hey, if you look at this collection, you might find materials related to X, Y, and Z. And they might say, well, I'm not really actually interested in X, Y, and Z, and I'd rather look at something else. And that can go a long way towards not having researchers sort of waste their time looking at collections that aren't relevant to the information need that they're trying to meet. And finally, a reference interview should help the researcher stretch the boundaries of the search space. So it should allow researchers to explore the different contexts of records, look more into the who, what, where, when, and why of records, and hopefully encounter more information which may be relevant to their information need. So again, it's just an opportunity for researchers to go into the process thinking, this is what I want, this is what I'm looking for, and as their focus is adjusted, as they're more aware of the possible information that they might get from different resources that the archive has, as they continue to explore the contextual web surrounding records, they may realize that they're actually looking for something different. They may realize that there are resources out there that they weren't aware of, and that gives them an opportunity to maybe reconsider their question, maybe reconsider what their information request is. And it just provides an environment where they may be more successful at meeting their information need. Now, it's not a guarantee, of course, that this process is going to be successful, 100% of the time. It may be that that reference archivists go through this process with researchers, and they're still unable to find information that the researcher is looking for. And then maybe you can start back again. Maybe the archivist can suggest, other archives to contact, or other sources of information outside of the archive that might be available. But it's not always going to be a successful process, and that's just sort of the nature of the beast. But I guess if you learn that a certain archive doesn't have the information that they're looking for, then that's okay, because maybe you're thinking about what exactly you needed has gotten more nuanced and has evolved, and that can give you more of an idea of what you might want to look for through other means. And as the Miller chapter notes on page 251, the level of reference interview interaction will depend on the needs of researchers and their research experience. So for an experienced researcher, they might need a lot of help clarifying their search requests. They might need a lot of help adjusting the focus of their search. But if someone has done a lot of research and they have a really good idea of exactly what it is they're looking for, and they just need, some help maybe figuring out how to access that particular set of information, then this reference interview process might be pretty quick and pretty efficient. It just kind of depends on how experienced the researcher is. It depends on how complex their information need is. So, if they are just writing a play for 8th graders, then they're going to have different needs and expectations than if they are writing their thesis or something like that. And again, the quality of processing, the quality of arrangement description can make this whole process easier. So if you have arrangement description that's really thorough, then it can be easier to tell a researcher what they might get from a collection, because you have a good idea of what's actually in the collection. It can be easier to help a researcher stretch the boundaries of the search space if you have a finding aid that is really detailed and has a lot of terms that a researcher can search for. So again, just to kind of connect arrangement and description with the reference interview process and research services as a whole. So we can also connect the reference interview to these different types of archival reference knowledge. So figuring out which collections might be relevant, you can attach that to knowledge of holdings, contextual knowledge, domain knowledge. Helping researchers access the records contained in collections, again, goes back to the access arc. Helping researchers understand how to consult records can be connected to research, so different research strategies that they can use to work with the materials. And for how to interpret information, helping researchers with research strategies, or helping them understand the physical records or the digital records that they're looking at, can be tied to research and artifactual, the research and artifactual records knowledge types. So the researcher services aspect of archiving does involve a lot of mediations by archivists, and it's important to consider how these mediations can impact social memory. So if certain records are valued over others, say these records are placed online and others aren't, and so those are the ones that researchers work with and want to consult because they're easier to access as opposed to other records, then that can result in some information becoming more widely known and widely used than other information in other collections. Or if an archivist maybe knows more about one particular collection, or for whatever reason really likes one particular collection, and they're not as familiar with, or maybe don't like another collection, even though both of them are relevant, if they only steer a researcher towards one of those collections and not both, then that could be a mediation that is a value judgment by archivists as well. And again, that can result in certain information being used in articles, being used in documentaries or other products of research, and digested by the public and understood by the public and incorporated into social memory, whereas collections that aren't used as often, or maybe not used at all because they aren't as valued as highly by archivists and by reference archivists in particular, then that information can be, obviously it still exists, but sort of neglected and ignored and not really a part of how people understand a certain person, place, or event. And this is related to valuing some resources over others. So if as a reference archivist you direct researchers to online collections and you don't really connect them with online finding aids as much, then that can impact their understanding of a particular set of records, and that can shape what their final product of research looks like as well. And again, there may be a temptation to put more effort into particular researchers. So if you have someone that you're really vibing with and you really want to go out of the way to support them in their research, and you help them find information that maybe they wouldn't have found otherwise, and then you have another researcher that maybe is exploring a topic that doesn't interest you, or maybe they're having a bad day, so they're a little prickly in one of your email interactions, and you're like, well, fine, screw this guy, then that can have impact on social media as well. And I'm sorry, social memory as well, because again, you're connecting researchers with, or not connecting researchers with, particular sets of information, and that can be reflected in what use they ultimately make of that information. And it's just, it's pretty unprofessional, right? No matter how much a patron is aggravating you. I had a lot of patrons at the AC that were pretty pushy and annoying, but you just have to kind of work through it and still try and provide as even a playing field as possible, and try not to value certain researchers over others, even though it might be tempting sometimes. So next we'll talk about the different types of curatorship in archives and how they can influence researcher services. Creation by the individual traditionally named as the curator, obviously, they determine what records survive for researchers to access in the future. If they say, I'm going to get rid of this for whatever reason, then that can eliminate possible research uses of materials in the future. It's interesting to consider how the original creator of a record could be used as a source for a reference interview as well. So maybe using your archive's donor information to contact someone and say, hey, I have someone who's interested in using the records that you donated. Can you provide a little bit more information about this? And that can definitely shape how certain records within their collection are used and viewed by the public. The same thing could be true with the communities to which creators belong. So if you have a person's records and maybe they're not around anymore, but you know other members of their community, or you're in contact with other members of their community, they might be able to help you if they share maybe specific identities or backgrounds. Then they might have information about a collection or about a culture or about a community that you as an archivist may not possess, that your researcher may not possess. So a community can definitely be a good resource of knowledge for reference archivists and researchers. And the same with custodians. So especially if it's someone's personal archives, maybe grandma's not around anymore, but there are people in the family who may be able to serve as sources for information and in turn shape how a set of records is viewed. So we've talked about some of the ways that archivists can sort of shape the products of research, either through online access portals or through the reference interview. It's also interesting to think of creation by activators and how that relates to researcher services. So if someone comes in and uses a collection and maybe a few weeks later you have someone who wants to use the same collection, it might not necessarily be a bad idea to contact the original person and say, hey, I have this other person who's working with the same collection you are. What can you tell me about this and this and this? And use them as a resource to get more information about archival records that you can pass on to other researchers. It may be that they don't want to share because they have some like hot academic scoop that they don't want anyone else to know about, but maybe they're willing to, and that can be a useful resource. So a lot of these different creators can be really valuable resources for reference archivists to use. And maybe they could even be incorporated into online collections as well. And that will allow researchers to have access to expertise and knowledge beyond just what the archive itself or even the records themselves are able to provide. And these different creators can provide some contextual information which might be really helpful when a researcher is trying to interpret what they're looking at and how what they're looking at can solve the information need that they have. Okay, so we'll wrap things up by talking about the importance of documenting reference services, which is something that the Laura Mueller chapter for this week talks about. So this idea of collecting information about the research services or reference services that an archive provides, and using that to measure just how useful researcher services within an archive are. So maybe if you see that a lot of people are looking at a collection that's online and they're still not really able to find the information that they're looking for, then you can say, all right, well, maybe there's a problem here and we should go in and try and provide additional information about this collection, maybe some additional contextual clues in order to help people find what they're looking for without having to actually contact the archive. It can also be used to advocate for more support for the archive. So if you can go to your boss and say, hey boss, our archive answered 100 reference requests last month. And not only that, but these reference requests turned into 5 published articles, then that can go a long way towards establishing the value and overall utility of the archive. It can really demonstrate how the archive is connecting with the public, how the archive is helping the public, helping the community, helping the organization that the archive is a part of, and that can go a long way towards justifying why the archive exists in the first place, which unfortunately is something that archives frequently have to do. And so this goes back to the idea of reference as outreach, and people like to see impact in really kind of cut and dry ways, and being able to say we worked with X number of researchers last month is something that a lot of people can really understand and appreciate fairly simply. So it's always a good thing to be able to share with the people that are writing your archives budget and determining, if you get to hire another archivist or not. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. I hope that you've enjoyed learning more about researcher services. It's something that we cover in more detail in our Information Studies 752 outreach course, if that's something that you're interested in the future. So yeah, I hope that you have appreciated kind of the complexity of researcher services and how it's more than just answering reference requests, and also the complexities of the different types of knowledge that reference archivists are asked to have at least some background in. And it can definitely be a responsibility that is a little overwhelming to know so many things about so many things. But if you combine your experience and expertise with the researcher's experience and expertise, and hopefully the experience and expertise of others, then very frequently you'll be able to at least help the researcher a lot of the way, if not all of the way. And yeah, it's just something that people can value so much and something that can reflect really well on your archive and the value that it provides. So it's a very important, vital part of archiving. And as I talked about earlier on, one that connects really well with a lot of their topics in this course. So thanks for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and take care.